So after having gone through fragmentation and populism and Bannonization as presumably threats to democracy, we will see how resilient are democracies. And to answer that question is Jørgen Møller. He has come from Aarhus in Denmark, where he is a professor at the Institute of Political Science at the Aarhus University. So his main research topic is democracy. He is studying its ups and downs and the link between conflict and democratization, among many other things. He's working on a book about Europe in between the two world wars, called Democratic Stability in an Age of Crisis. You will use some of the findings from that research when talking about how resilient democracies are today, I assume. Jørgen, the floor is yours.
Tove for the kind introduction, and thanks to Kate and her team for inviting me. My presentation is called Resilient Democracies, Comparing the Interwar Period and Now, and as the subtitle shows, it will be more backward-looking in a sense than the rest of the panel. However, my point of departure is much the same as the conference in general, namely that there is this prevailing crisis mood at present. And when you speak about democracy, then one symptom of this crisis in the view of many people is the success of a string of populist politicians and individuals, both in Northern America and in Europe. And in 2017 and 2018 alone, we've seen a string of books, many of which have become international bestsellers. For instance, Lewitsky and Ziblatt's Wonderful How Democracies Die, which basically argue that we are deep into the throes of a major democratic crisis. And it seems fair to say that these books have basically established themselves as a new genre. And one illustration of that is a review of Lewitsky and Ziblatt's book in Washington Post by Carlos Lozada, where at some point he wrote that this is really the best Death of Democracy book I read in 2018. Besides sharing this message that we have this deep-seated democratic crisis, very many of these books, not all of those I showed, but many of them, hark back to the interwar period for parallels. And you can basically say that many of them make what could be termed the interwar analogy, which basically is the argument that crisis led to democratic breakdown in the 1920s and especially, of course, in the 1930s, and therefore it can happen again today. And just to illustrate this is a blog post by Lewitsky and Ziblatt, kind of a harbinger of the book they later wrote, where they at some point write that the experiences of interwar Europe remind us that Western democracies are not immune to collapse. Again, and in a nutshell, we're seeing strain and popular frustration today that reminds us of what we saw in the 20s and particularly in the 30s, and we must fear that the outcomes will also be similar today. This is the argument made by people presenting this interwar analogy. Now, in a new book that Tove referred to, I and my two co-authors, Agnes Cornell of Lund University and Sven-Erik Skåning of Aarhus University, challenge this interwar analogy. And I'll spare you all the quantitative analysis, or for that matter, the qualitative analysis we do in this book, and try to present some of the take-home points that comes out of this work. And our point of departure in the book is that if we look back at interwar Europe, the book also deals with Latin America, I should say, but I'll only speak about Europe here in the interest of time. But if we look back at interwar Europe, and apologies for this being in Danish, I was too lazy to make a new one, then what we find are two sets or clusters of democracies. We find a number of democracies that survived throughout the 20s and 30s. These are the green countries, and to them we can of course add countries such as Canada, the United States, New Zealand and Australia, which obviously are not in the map. And then we find a large number of democracies, these are the yellow ones, which broke down. And of course, we're not the first to point out that we find this pattern. For instance, British sociologist Michael Mann refers to this as the two Europes in his 2005 book on fascism. Now, if we look at these two groups, we can identify something that sets them apart. And one of the most important differences between these two groups is basically the timing of the original democratization. In a sense, we can say that there's a very simple pattern here if we factor in whether these countries democratized before World War I or after the armistice in 1918, because it turns out that all the old democracies, those that had democratized endogenously, you might say, before World War I, survived throughout the interwar period, whereas almost all the new democracies broke down. Czechoslovakia and Finland are the only exceptions to that pattern. You might wonder why we place Sweden here, but it's because we argue that they only finally democratized in 1917. Others would say that it happened earlier, and if so, the pattern only becomes more clear-cut. We can actually go one step further here and say that these countries, these countries have been democratically stable for a very long period. So if we use a kind of minimal definition that is popular in political science and economics, where democracy is a place where losers accept to lose power, then we can say that the US has been a democracy for more than 200 years, Belgium since 1830, the Netherlands and Switzerland since 1848, Norway, where we are, since 1884, Denmark since 1901, and so on and so forth. Indeed, if we label these countries as the Northwest, as I have done here, and look at them, then the most recent democratic breakdown, according to this minimal definition, occurred back in 1851 with Napoleon III's coup d'etat. And on that basis, we can object to the premise that Lewitsky and Ziblatt present on the very first page of How Democracies Die, where they write, and I quote here, "Even though we know democracies are always fragile, the one in which we live has somehow managed to defy gravity." It turns out that there are, in fact, a large number of democracies that have managed to defy gravity in this sense. Now, our book is not on this entire period. It's on the interwar period, the 20s and 30s. And what's so interesting about that period is, of course, exactly how crisis-ridden it was. There was the First World War with millions of veterans who had to find their place back in society. There were the peace treaties of Versailles and Trianon after the war. There was the Bolshevist revolution in 1917 and the attempt to export world revolution, for instance, to Germany afterwards. There was fighting in much of Eastern Europe and on the Balkans in the early 20s. There was, of course, the rise and successes of the great totalitarian movements in this period. And finally, there was the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in modern times. And on top of that, there was actually a very nasty spell of hyperinflation in much of Central Europe in the early 1920s. What we argue in the book is that when we look at these crises, it's really completely unsurprising that so many democracies broke down. More particularly, it's unsurprising that new and fragile democracies were unable to cope with this kind of crisis. We know from a big research literature that new democracies are very fragile in the face of crisis. What is much more surprising when we look at this period is how resilient, how stable the old democracies were. And one manifestation of this stability that I actually wanted to show you, but I think in the interest of time I'll skip it pretty quickly, is my own country, Denmark, where we find some radicalization, but where the moderate parties disowned these radical tendencies, fought them within and outside of their ranks, and together provided crisis packages that at least sent the signal that the parliamentary system was not paralyzed in the face of crisis. To conclude, I'm almost out of time here. The interwar period was a period of repeated crises that all democracies of the day had to face. What is most surprising when we look into this period is not the many breakdowns in new democracies, but the striking resilience of the old democracies. So in that sense, the interwar period basically shows that once democracy has become established, it is extremely stable, and again I showed it in a more general sense. And we argue we have been making false historical analogies to the interwar period because we have been looking at the new and fragile democracies, and if we want to say something about the challenges our democracies face today and the potential to overcome them, we should look at the old democracies. And on this basis, there's room for a much more optimistic conclusion about what happened in the interwar period. To finish, and from one grinning face to another grinning face, what does this tell us about today's challenges? This event is being live streamed, so I'll put my conclusions into the mouth of other people, more distinguished experts as well on these issues. Here is Michael Ignatieff actually in an interview in a Danish newspaper, which I translated probably too quickly, being confronted with all these crises. And what he said in response to it is that, and I quote here, "The problem is that many have such a short memory and then they become overwhelmed by a bit of adversity. But try to lift the gaze a bit. Look at how far as a world society we have come since 1945. And secondly, here's William Easterly, even when our politicians are not exactly the sharpest tools in the shed, rich democracies somehow work." And I finish here.